Tonight, as we're very pleased to welcome for this seventh and final lecture in the series, Stephen Shapin. And Stephen, like Jeffrey Pilcher, for example, who talked about Planet Taco, is a historian, and he is the Franklin L. Ford Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University. Stephen Oregon is not unfamiliar to Stephen Shapin. He did his undergraduate degree in biology at Reed College and then did graduate work in genetics at the University of Wisconsin before doing his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in the history and sociology of science. He also returned to the West Coast before going to Harvard. He was at the University of California, San Diego, and before that he was in almost 20 years at the University of Edinburgh, where he was a pioneer in a small group of pioneers who really reformulated questions about the history and sociology of science and looked at the history and current practices in science within a social framework that included the development of a particular approach called the social construction of knowledge. Stephen's research and teaching have covered the time frame from the 17th century until the 21st century. His work has received international awards and recognition for the books that he has written and the other work he has done on traditions of gentleman science and scientists, of experimentation, and of the construction of scientific truths. Some of the books, three of the books, are outside at the table that the OSU bookstore has this evening. Stephen Shapin's newest book is coming out in the fall with the University of Chicago Press on the scientific life, a moral history of a late modern vocation. And this book, as we were talking about it today, is thoroughly 20th and even 21st century, looking at corporate research laboratories and scientific entrepreneurship in the relationship to universities and academic communities. There are certain themes that infuse all of most of Stephen Shapin's work, whether it's the 17th century or the 20th century book that he's just written or what he's going to discuss this evening. And those themes, when he's talking about the sciences and medicine, have to do with an argument that scientific science and scientific practice is not impersonal, but profoundly personal, and that personal virtue and trust among individuals are crucial factors in the credibility of any kind of expertise. Questions about values and virtues highlight the current historical research that he's doing on dietetics and on the production and consumption of foods, about which he will be talking tonight. I also want to mention that I think for many of us, local foods may be a special interest here in the Willamette Valley and also here at Oregon State University. And I'd like to put a plug in for a special event next Thursday, which is going to take place in the restaurant Pangea at the Memorial Union. The students in the Department of Nutrition have designed a menu which will be available from 10:30 in the morning until 3 o'clock, that's all based on local foods. And this is their project, which is ending the academic year. So you might want to try out Pangea next Thursday. Stephen Shapin was a lecturer in the very first year of the Horning Lecture Series, and so it's a real pleasure to have him return. I hope that you will join me now in welcoming Stephen Shapin, who's going to talk about eating good in the neighborhood, the medical and moral history of dietary localism.
Thank you so much. It's more than the usual cliche when I say I'm delighted to be here. It feels at many years' distance like coming home. I also think that anyone who's benefited from Mary Jo and I and Bob and I's hospitality is in danger of making a contribution to localism, because I'm not sure I want to leave. A family sits down to a meal. It's a thoroughly globalized meal. There's fish from Spain, there's bread from grain grown in Tunisia, the wines, because it's a reasonably festive meal, but not too far out of the ordinary, come from lots of places. There's sherry from the south of Spain, there's Rhine wine from Germany, there's claret from Bordeaux, there are wines from Greece and Lebanon. The family's alpha male has a beer before the meal. It's imported from Hamburg. There are olives from Greece, there's olive oil from Tuscany, there's dried fruit from Turkey, and the spices that have kicked the food up a notch come from the furthest reaches of the world: pepper from the Malabar coast of India, nutmeg, ginger, and cloves from the Moluccan Islands of Indonesia. That's the way we eat now. What our immediate neighborhood or nation supplies isn't enough or isn't to our taste. We're accustomed to being fed from all parts of the world. The globalized meal is an index of the globalized commercial and political world in which we now live. And for many commentators, it's a mark of what's very wrong with how we now live. It's inauthentic, it's wasteful, it may be exploitative, and it shows how out of touch we've recently become with the realities of how our food is actually produced. Eating like that is a violation of proper moral order. So says the slow food movement. So say Alice Waters and Michael Pollan. Dietary localism is the world we've lost, and we hunger for the past. Except that the meal I've described could have been put together and consumed in 16th century London, and many features of it were available in Greek and Roman antiquity. So let's start by appreciating the sense in which we have never been local. There never was a time in historical memory when food and drink were not part of a global export trade, nor when it was thought right and proper that what you ate ought to come exclusively or mainly from just where you lived. Aliment from faraway places was used. Its properties and powers were thought about, discussed, and debated for as long as there's been a historical record. This is very well known to food historians, if not to many popular writers now commending dietary localism. In antiquity, there was a great Mediterranean and transalpine trade in wine, oil, olives, honey, dried fruit, preserved fish, and grain. Athens and Rome were both substantially fed by grain from Africa, the Near East, and Sicily. The global trade in spices goes back several millennia before the Christian era, across the Indian Ocean, from Asia to the Middle East, and on to all parts of Europe. The Romans sent huge fleets to India for pepper, and Roman soldiers on Hadrian's Wall between Scotland and England were consuming the stuff. As one historian of the spice trade writes, the First World Empire, Rome, also boasted the first world cuisine, with spice representing its farthest reaches. A taste for imported beer is not a recent yuppie innovation. There was a Europe-wide trade in hops from about the 10th century, and since hops function as a preservative in beer, making it beer and not ale, there was a thriving international trade in beer from around 1200. In the 1580s, Holinshed's Chronicles, much used by Shakespeare, bemoaned the negligence of the English in viticulture. Remarkably, he thought nothing to do with the soil in England or the climate, but sadly commented that England insatiably sucked in all the world's wines, as it does now. Neither do I mean this of small wines, only small wines being non-fortified, as claret, white, red, French, etc., which amount to 56 different sorts according to the number of regions from whence they come, but also of the 30 kinds of Italian, Grecian, and Spanish wines. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, fancied himself a wine connoisseur, making the first explicit literary mention of a specific chateau, Aubryon. But he was happy when his personal cellar was well stocked with claret, sack, which is sherry, tinto, which is possibly Rioja, Rhenish wines, and Malaga. When, with the restored monarchy in 1660, the London theatres reopened, the preferred between-the-act snack was an orange from Spain, 6 pence apiece, and a gentleman didn't haggle. Orange selling was the job that gave Nell Gwynn her start in life. She rose higher by going lower, as it were. And by the late 17th century, over 11 million oranges and lemons were being imported into England, while fleets of boats laden with Mediterranean dried fruit arrived in time for making the Christmas pudding. A Restoration luxury grocer in Cornhill, sounding a bit like Harrods or Dean and DeLuca in Manhattan these days, would sell you your pick of olive oils from Florence or Genoa, as well as caviar, mangoes, samphire, pickled mushrooms, and walnuts. Then, as now, if you had the wherewithal, you could get pretty much what you wanted from wherever it came in the world. That much belongs to economic and social history. But what about cultural history? How did people in the past think about the sources of what they ate and drank, and how did that thought relate to conceptions of health and disease, to ideas of personal and group identity, and to notions of how it was right and proper to act in the world? These are enormous and enormously resonant questions, because traditional ways of thinking about aliment were enfolded into medical and moral cultures in ways that really do belong to a world that we have lost. That part of traditional medicine called dietetics, alternatively regimen or hygiene, was a self-making culture. That's to say, it gave people a conceptual vocabulary and a set of practical counsels that explained why it was you were what you ate. And it did so in a way whose framework encompassed the human body and mind, the nature of aliment, the causes of health and disease, and the constitution of the cosmos. So the humoral theory that was elaborated by Galen from the earlier Hippocratic corpus, Galen in the 2nd century AD, parsed body, element, and the cosmos in terms of the 4 elements, earth, air, water, and fire. The 4 qualities possessed by the elements, cold, hot, moist, and dry, and the 4 humors of the human body, blood, which was hot and moist, phlegm, which was cold and moist, yellow bile, or choler, which was hot and dry, and black bile, or melancholy, which was cold and dry. Everything in the world possessed these 4 qualities to different degrees. Each of the 4 seasons was identified with its distinctive pair of qualities, and each human being possessed an innate constitution, a temperament or a complexion, in which one or other of these humors was predominant. So you could refer to types of people as melancholic, phlegmatic, sanguinary, and so forth. Now, what came to be called the 6 things non-natural in medical dietetics were those things in principle that were under your volitional control, that affected the balance of humors in a body, and which, if you properly managed them, led to health, or if you did not, led to imbalance and disease. And these 6 things non-natural in dietetics included food and drink for sure, but also included the airs and waters of the places where you live or where you chose to situate your house, exercise, sleeping and waking, and evacuations, which included sexual release. The non-naturals were the things that you did, your rationally managed, or at least rationally manageable, transactions with the environment, as opposed to the natural constitution, to use modern inappropriate vocabulary, your genetics with which you were born. But the management of the non-naturals was powerful. On the one hand, you were constantly advised from the time of Galen through the early modern period into really the early 19th century not to make abrupt changes in the way in which you lived. And you were also reminded that your constitution was to a degree flexible. and that you could rationally refashion yourself. There's a proverb, custom is a second nature, but that was meant to be taken literally in this culture. Dietary custom was always a major consideration for travelers, for soldiers and diplomats who knew they had to get used to foreign fare, and was vitally important during the eras of European colonialization and American expansion towards the West. It was true that exotic climates and foods were serious challenges to temperaments unused to them, and it was also true that many people, if not all, could get used to them. But since such things, in other words, exposures to new foods and drinks, were understood to be transformative, it was unsettling to think what going native might mean on a constitutional level. And these were features from Columbus through the European imperialism in India and Africa to the American West that really were very important considerations of what it might mean to go native. So regimen, which included the airs and waters and the foods of your environment, importantly made you who you were, and that was understood. It did so for an individual. So, for example, in the 17th century, the Czech philosopher and social reformer Comenius repeated ancient wisdom that he who feeds on dry meat is dry of complexion, he that feeds on moist is phlegmatic, etc., because for the most part a man retains the qualities of those living creatures on whose flesh he feeds, as he that feeds on beef is strong, he that feeds on venison is nimble. And the same applied to groups of people who shared a local climate and the availability of foods and drinks in their locale. And in a historical setting in which the majority of people did not move around a lot, and where despite these qualifications, people's fare was very substantially local, you could give a powerful account of human character in terms of local weather, local terrain, and local foods and drinks. Where you located your house, north to north facing or south facing, where the winds came, was understood to be under volitional control. But it was understood that much of what constituted your climate had to be taken just as it was. So, for example, in the Hippocratic corpus, the Scythians were the kind of people they were because of where it was they lived. Temperature, winds, waters, and of course, how these environmental things were made manifest in their local sources of food and drink. Conversely, in the ancient corpus, Asia was a land where everything the land produced was much finer and larger than elsewhere. The weather was better, it was more temperate, more even, and this is from the Hippocratic corpus. Likewise, the men are well made, large, and with good physique, and the character of the inhabitants is milder and less passionate. You see this in Marco Polo's travels, and to some extent you even see it in Columbus, who thought that's where he was. You will find as a general rule, Hippocrates wrote, that the constitutions and the habits of a people follow the nature of the land where they live. And Plato agreed, writing in the Laws, that there are great differences in the power of regions to produce good men. Heat and cold and water and food have great effects both on body and soul. So that aliment, you understand, was cosmologically connected to human constitution, both at an individual level and at a group level. Cosmological connection between the you are, who you were, and what you ate. Now, here the Hippocratic and Galenic framework, which was stable for a very long time, contains some notable ambivalences, or at least varying interpretations, concerning whether or not, why, and to what extent your aliment should be invariably or mainly local, or whether it was all right or even medically a good idea to provide yourself with fare from far away. So start with the notion of individual temperament and assume that you're a person in good health or temper. So, for example, the 16th century writer Thomas Eliot wrote in his Castle of Health that if you were healthy, you should opt for foods that, and this is a crucial phrase, agreed with your constitution. And note that agreeing with meant that your aliment should qualitatively match your temperament, and that agreeing with could be empirically assessed by the experience of both digestion and of taste. You could tell whether something didn't agree with you when it didn't go down well. It didn't sit well on your stomach. As my grandmother was saying, well, this doesn't agree with me, meaning, or when it didn't come out the other end in due form or quantity. The Latin saying, quod sapit nutrit, if it tastes good, it's good for you, which my grandmother also said, has to be understood in the cosmology of humors and qualities. That really is a conceptual world that we have lost. What pleases your tongue, what tastes good, does so because it was understood that its qualities, hot, cold, moist, and dry, match or agree with those of your body. And so you could say that local fare suited you because their nature suited your nature, both individually and collectively. And in so saying, dietary localism had a really important moral dimension. If people identified themselves individually and collectively as having certain physical and mental qualities, and if their local food and drink helped to constitute those qualities, then it was all good. It was who you were. And at certain historical junctures, there might also be moral commendations of dietary localism that were almost wholly free of the medical framework. So that in Roman antiquity, for example, criticisms of decadence and luxury picked out immoral obsession with variety, with sophistication, and with the taste for the exotic. Plutarch moralized against the indecorum, no better than gluttony, that made people think it were indecent not to taste of everything which is either a rarity or of great price, as udder, Italian mushrooms, Samian cakes, or snow from Egypt. From Roman antiquity to the time of Columbus, the fanatic quest for spices from the East seemed to many pious commentators immoral hedonism. Juvenal's 11th satire commended the dietary simple life, not for Paris Hilton, against gluttonous exoticism. A little goat from his own farm at Tiber, asparagus from the local hills gathered by his own bailiff's wife, fresh local eggs, grapes, and apples. This is the way Romans used to eat, while now they ransacked the empire for dainties that were no good for them and no good for civic morals. In later periods, some Dutch Golden Age commentators condemned exotic aliment, including East Indian spices, as dangerous both to health and sound morality. Into the 18th and 19th centuries, state policy worried about the demands on the exchequer posed by tastes for foreign goods, including sugar, tea, wines, and spices. Better policy and better statecraft to adapt the citizens to local fare. A cosmopolitan cuisine was ruining the balance of payments, debauching the people, and encouraging imprudent foreign colonial and military entanglements. One strand of dietetic culture commended dietary localism just because the nation and the race were what they ate, and because, of course, they valued who they were. Beef was proper fare for Englishmen, most especially English beef. On the eve of Agincourt, in Henry V, a French general notes that the English consume great meals of beef and that accordingly they eat like wolves and fight like devils, while his comrade assures him with the news that Henry's army had run out of beef. Then shall we find tomorrow they have only stomachs to eat and none to fight. The late 16th century dietary writer Thomas Cogan observed that beef of all flesh is most usual amongst Englishmen, that it was more plentiful there than in any other country, and that hospitality in England was defined by offering beef. But he also noted how well it doth agree with the nature of Englishmen, that it bringeth more strong nourishment than other meats, so making the English as fierce as they were reputed to be. Now, moreover, not all nations' beef was alike in its virtues. Burton acknowledged that some writers accounted Portuguese beef to be the best and most wholesome, while we commend ours. Daniel Defoe described the true-born Englishman in 1700 as beefily bold beyond other races. It was beef that went into the English genome, so to speak. Eager to fight and lavish of their blood, and equally of fear and forecast void, the Pict has made them sour, the Dane morose, false from the Scot, and from the Norman worse. What honesty they have, the Saxon gave them. The climate makes them terrible and bold, and English beef their courage doth uphold. Foreigners remarked on not just on English preference for beef and their local beef specifically, but also on their disdain for effete continental cuisine. An Italian diplomat in the late 16th century remembered a speech of Sir Roger Williams to an idle Spaniard. "Why, saith he, Sir Roger, in England we have good sirloins of beef and dainty capons to eat with your sauce, with all meat worthy the name of sustenance, but you have sauce and no sustenance." Cogan evidently shared a common view that the Scots were even fiercer than the English. Braveheart, I suppose, and that their diet both reflected and caused that, both on the authority of St. Jerome. What did St. Jerome know about the Scots? But there it is. And through his own experience, he wrote that the Scots were cannibals. And when they found in the forest herds of swine, beasts, and cattle, they would cut off the buttocks of the boys which kept them, and also the women's paps, and took that to be the most dainty and delicate fare. Much later, Samuel Johnson famously agreed that the Scots were rude and uncivilized, his dictionary defining oats as a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. In general, the English prided themselves not just as great beef eaters, but as great eaters. The courtesy writer Henry Peacham observed that this had to do with climate. Northern nations are of all other the greatest eaters and drinkers, but of those the French say, "We of England have the best stomachs and are the greatest trenchermen of the world. Les Anglois sont les plus grands mangeurs de tout le monde." Localism went down to the county level. Cider and perry, for pear cider, are common drinks in Worcestershire and Gloucestershire, and they are cold and windy drinks, yet as Robert Burton wrote in The Anatomy of Melancholy, in some shires of England and Normandy in France, 'tis their common drink, and they are no whit offended with it. In many Mediterranean countries, Burton said, they live most on roots and raw herbs, and it agrees well with them, which to a stranger would cause much grievance. And so it was in general with local food and local natures. In Wales, they live most on white meats, in Holland on fish, roots, and butter. And so at this day in Greece, they had much rather feed in fish than flesh. With us, we feed on flesh most part, as all northern countries do, and it would be very offensive to us to live after their diet or they to live after ours. We drink beer, they wine. They use oil, we butter. Montaigne, always a great supporter of custom over rational expertise, wrote in the late 16th century, "It is for habit to give form to our life just as it pleases. It is all-powerful in that it is Circe's drink, which varies our nature as it sees fit. A Spaniard's stomach cannot stand our way of eating, nor can ours stand to drink Swiss fashion. We are afraid of the wine at the bottom of the cask. In Portugal, its flavor is considered delicious, and it is the drink of princes." So dietary localism could be and was recommended because it suited your nature, both medically and morally. At the same time, traditional dietetics warned you that your health might be resting on an elementary knife edge. and that you had constantly to be mindful of countering tendencies towards humoral imbalance through a diet that corrected for an individual or collective constitution formed by nature or custom. So if people think that the super medicalized self-monitoring is a feature of modern California, no. We're actually quite relaxed compared to Galenic medicine. And so, by the late medieval period and through the early modern, a torrent of printed dietaries, dietary books, was structured through three main themes. First, there was a romp through the temperaments and the non-naturals. Second, there was a commendation of moderation or temperance. And third, there was a sequential enumeration of items of aliment, purslane, coney, capon, young sheep, claret, malaga, etc. The effects of these aliments on the human body, and specifically whether they suited or agreed with people of different constitutions. Now, dietary writers sometimes did disagree on the qualities of specific foods and drinks, but there was a great degree of consensus about many of the major aliments, and their conceptual vocabulary was very widely diffused across European culture. Essentially everybody from late medieval through 18th century Europe knew this conceptual vocabulary and ways of describing foods and natures. And it provided a shared language for talking about the relationship between humankind and the environment, about proper conduct, and about the differences between individuals and differences between groups of people, and why they were as they were. Now, as they went through the list of available foods and drinks, the dietaries not only mentioned whether they were hot, cold, moist, or dry, but also specified also for whom and when a given item was indicated or contraindicated. So that, for example, lamb meat, an early 17th century writer said, increaseth crude and phlegmatic humors, so you shouldn't eat lamb in the winter. Nor should old men, who are presumed to be phlegmy, eat it. And it is better for those whose temperament is hot and dry. Beef, Robert Burton wrote in the Anatomy of Melancholy, is a strong and hearty meat, but it breeds gross melancholy blood, good for such as are sound and of a strong constitution for laboring men, if ordered aright, and unfit for such as lead a resty life, like professors. And typically, dietary writers specify the degrees from first to sixth. First degree being the least intense, and sixth the most intense of each type of aliment. So Burton pointed out that beef was cold in the first degree, dry in the second, and that was why it was not so good for melancholics, whose dominant humor was, of course, cold and dry. Similarly, Eliot observed that dried figs, but not fresh figs, it went down to that level of detail, were hot in the first degree and dry in the second. The thyme, the herb, was hot and dry, both in the third degree, and so on and so forth. Now, some English writers asserted the superior suitability of ale as the national drink, but most accepted the normalcy because of the biblical mentions of wine, and in moderation the healthfulness of wine in the local diet, even though little, if any, wine was made in England. This was, after all, part of the divine plan to encourage global trade. This is the 16th century. So God hath divided his blessings, that one nation might have need of another, and one country might have intercourse with another. So wine was understood to be a globalized beverage, and its geographical origins had a lot to do with its virtues for the individual and the racial constitution. Galen wrote that wine is hot in the second degree, but by the early modern period, dietary writers offered a more nuanced account. The qualities of wines varied according to their source. Sack, sherry, is hotter than white wine or claret. Malmsey and muscadel are hotter than sack, and Madeira or Canary wine were hottest of all. So they were capable of saying Galen got it wrong when he said that white wine was the least hot. He should have qualified this by restricting the comparison to the white and reds of a specific region, terroir. So the white wine of France is not so hot as the claret or red of the same country, for otherwise the red wines of France are not so hot nor so strong as the white wines of some other countries, like those of Greece. That's to say, a medical theory of terroir was part of the common cultural vocabulary of the early modern period. You wanted hotter wine as you got older, but the studious and sedentary probably shouldn't take these hotter wines at all. White wine, pardon the language, provoketh or causeth one to piss more than another, whereby it is proved to be more piercing than other wine, and to have greater strength to open. And for these properties, I think white wine more convenient for students than any other. Perhaps Bud Light can perform the same function. You can reflect on why it's more important for students. That means scholars as well, to piss more, but perhaps for discussion. Even beer and ale figured in this medical, moral, and cosmological choreography. Beer, with its added hops, hot and dry, still seems something of an unnatural brew to 17th century English dietary writers. Ale was the drink of the British Isles, not beer. In the 16th century, Andrew Boord pronounced beer a natural drink for a Dutchman. And now of late days it is much used in England, to the detriment of any Englishmen. Especially it killeth them, the which be troubled with the colic and the stone. For the drink is a cold drink, yet it doth make a man fat, and doth inflate the belly, as it doth appear by the Dutchmen's faces and bellies. Thomas Venner reckoned that beer which was too bitter, that's to say too hoppy, bred fumes which in turn caused rheums and distillations, but the same qualities might help people of a choleric temperament and with hot stomachs. Both the globalized nature of traditional cuisine and the corrective role of exotic elements are most evident in the case of spices. The whole point of spices for Europeans was that they were in every respect exotic. They came from the furthest reaches of the world, their prices testify to that, and so did their aromas and the powers attributed to them. Now, there's several ways in which spices took their place in traditional cosmological and dietetic thinking. In late antiquity and the Middle Ages, many scholars thought that nature produced more wonders, prodigies, and powers at the margins of the world than they did at its center, which is reckoned originally to be Greece and later northern Europe, perhaps by being exposed to more powerful celestial rays. You get this literature very strongly in the account of gemstones and things like the Bizarre stone. In the absence of secure geographical knowledge, some spices were presumed to have been carried down the rivers flowing from a lost earthly Garden of Eden, commonly identified as in Asia and specifically in India, hence the term for spices, still used in brewing, by the way, grains of paradise. Spices were believed literally to have come from another and better world and to have the new powers of this other and better world. That kind of cosmological thinking doesn't tightly connect with the Hippocratic Galenic framework, but within traditional dietetics, the qualities of spices were also stamped on them by their geographical origin. Like many exotic forms, for example, coffee, tea, and chocolate, spices were considered as medicines, sometimes possibly dangerous, like tomatoes, potatoes, and pineapples, but sometimes powerfully therapeutic before they became naturalized just as foods and flavoring agents. If they might not agree with you because their composition was so alien, nevertheless, for the same reason, they might powerfully correct bodily imbalances and therefore act as medicines. Spices were powerfully hot. Some were hotter than others. Kogan classified pepper to be hot and dry in the 4th degree, dissolving phlegm and wind. Cloves are hot and dry in the 3rd degree, dissolving superfluous humors and stirring up Venus. So, primitive Viagra. Cloves. I don't know that. Nutmeg, hot and dry in the 2nd degree, is the best spice for students. They, again, provoke urine, break wind, and comfort the brain. Food historians have rightly rejected the view that spices were valued mainly importantly for their ability to mask the stench of rotten meat. You know, the point's very simple. If you could afford spices, you could afford non-rotten meat. They're all agreed on that. But their use in cooking did nevertheless have a rationale in medical dietetics. They could be used to correct, that is, to balance out the cold and moist, and therefore phlegm-producing qualities of other foods, especially those common in northern climates. And so several of the characteristic savors of medieval and early modern European cookery, including the now seemingly odd use of what I call Christmas spices in drinks and savory dishes, and the obsession for sweet and sour preparations, may well have tickled the contemporary taste buds, but were also widely understood in Hippocratic Galenic humoral terms. In other words, as corrections, especially to the cold and wet characteristics of northern climates. The power attributed to spices derived from their exotic geographical origins. There was a Renaissance in early modern reaction to all this, and the equation of the global and the good did not go unchallenged. I've already mentioned moral and economic criticisms of European infatuation with aliment from far away. Whoever wanted to reassert ascetic, temperate, or domestic values could pick on tastes for the dietary exotic as marks of luxury, self-indulgence, or debauchery. Did not our own native lands produce enough, good enough, or even better? Did not our native foods, drinks, and medicines agree better with our native constitutions? So most famously, in the middle of the 17th century, the astrologer apothecary Nicholas Culpeper urged that Englishmen could effectively and cheaply cure themselves with such things only as grow in England, they being most fit for English bodies, both part of what Alex Cooper has recently called inventing the indigenous, especially since we're now in another period, as I'll indicate, of inventing the indigenous. But the idea of the indigenous and the virtues of the local reacted against the idea of the globalized exotic and its powers. And while nutmeg and cinnamon eventually lost their ascribed powers, it was not reflective localism of the sort we're seeing now that did it, but the facts of an ever more globalized world. The exotic became common, cheap, and domesticated. Over time, the global became the more or less taken for granted local, the stuff that's on the supermarket shelves. Except that we're increasingly asked now not to take dietary globalism for granted, to reflect upon it, and after reflecting upon it, to reject it. That's what made Locavore the Oxford University Press Word of the Year for 2005. I didn't know they had a Word of the Year, but that was it. And that's much of the substance and the appeal of Carlo Petrini's slow food movement, Michael Pollan's best-selling The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food, the flourishing of farmers markets, and the success of new American restaurants, many tracing their origin to Alice Walter's Shapin in Berkeley, that feature the local and the seasonal, and that advertise their intimate relations with local farmers, fishermen, and foragers of roots, herbs, and fungi. Just as academics have got into their stride describing, sometimes celebrating, more often lamenting, the globalized world in which we live, so the market for books and experiences that celebrate the local has never been better. Meantime, there is very little in the way of a market for academic inquiries that either question the extent to which we do now, or ever have, live in a globalized world, or, having sought to answer such a question, ask how we came to live and think as we do now. So there's not much a market for a performance like this. So, having attempted here to sketch what such a history of the dietary global and local might look like, I want to end by talking briefly about the changes that we really need to account for. First, despite the necessary reminder of the sense in which we have never been local, it would be silly to neglect the shock of the new, and especially the role of technology in bringing about substantial changes in degree. Refrigerated ships and railway cars, the 747, FedEx, and the invention of nitrogen-flushed cellophane bags for salad greens all changed a lot about how we are fed from the middle 19th century to the present. We not only eat globally now, we eat globally freshly, whatever we want, whenever we want it. So too did new political and financial conditions of global trade, including changing tariff structures and trading blocs. So too did changing tastes induced by tourism, ethnic diversity in much of the developed world, and of course, wealth and abundance. All these things and many more have been responsible for the acceleration of dietary globalism in the 20th and 21st centuries, and for such reaction against globalism as we're now seeing in the marketplace, both the intellectual and the commercial marketplace. But we can ask the same questions about ourselves as we asked about the past. How do we think about the sources of our element? Specifically, what drives dietary localism, and how do locavore sensibilities relate, if at all, to those of the traditional dietetic culture I've tried to describe? Again, two cultures are pertinent here, the medical and the moral. I say two cultures because that's the way they appear to us, but it is the historical career of the categories medical and moral that turns out to be pertinent to understanding what's happened to our current thinking about elementary sources. First, there's scarcely any sense in which the present-day stress on dietary localism belongs to medical culture. It's true. Common expert advice does frequently assert that dietary variety is good for you, the notion of the balanced diet now meaning different sorts of foodstuffs without any sense of a balance of qualities in the Galenic sense, and without any necessary identification of balance with disparate geographical sources. It's also true that some, not much, dietary localism reckons that locally sourced and maybe organically produced foods may possess good micronutrients or lack bad chemical residues, though it's hard to say that this is a very important strand of the reaction against globalism. Constituents, chemicals, are not qualities, and so far as official expertise is concerned, traditional dietetics is long dead. That now dead culture did not separate out what we now call the medical and the moral. And so a morally charged sense of who we are went together with expert recommendations of what we ought to eat so far as to live healthily and long. You ate locally in the past because it was likely to agree with your nature, and you might eat at a distance because it was likely to correct imbalances substantially brought about by local environment. That gave traditional dietetics immense authority and reach in the culture. It joined together what was good for you with what was good. It linked who you were as an individual to the circumstances you shared with your compatriots and neighbors. It provided the resources to insist on the wholesomely local and to commend cosmopolitan sophistication. So it's a protean culture, and all the more resonant and useful for that. So the death of dietetics meant the effective separation of the medical and the moral, advice about what was good for you and about what was good. And that's the main reason why it is, I think, intellectually interesting and culturally resonant to follow the historical career of dietary localism. It's one way among many to track the changing relationship between instrumental knowledge and moral sensibilities, between languages which folded together the instrumental and the moral, and contemporary languages which largely do not. If there is little of the now specifically medical about the new localism, one can say quite a lot about its moral dimensions.
And that moral imperative is probably by far the most important in present-day locavore sensibilities. We should eat locally because it's supposed to be good for the planet, because of biodiversity concerns, but mainly because of energy costs. And we should eat locally and seasonally because it tastes better, though many locavores do not seem to be recruited from the traditional gourmandizing classes. But above all, we should eat locally because it's the moral thing to do. As Adam Gott recently wrote in the New Yorker, localism is a movement made of pieties. The cult of seasonality was a taste that evolved into a politics. Localism is essentially a politics attempting to create a taste. It is built on the conviction that the industrial economics of food growing and delivery are bad for us and bad for the planet, but it also has an implicit moralistic attitude that prefers small country patches over large urban deserts. This in the magazine that 2 years before it published an influential essay called Green Manhattan on why high-density living is good for the planet. Historically, local food went together with hunger and famine, and Gopnik nicely makes a Veblenian, that's Thorsten Veblen, argument about cultural causes. Where a century ago all upwardly mobile people knew enough and had enough resources to get their hands on the most unseasonable foods from the most distant places in order to distinguish themselves, conspicuous consumption, from the peasant past and the laboring masses, their descendants now distinguish themselves by hustling after a peasant diet. One reading of the historical story I've told is that nutrition is among many cultural domains that have experienced a separation between the instrumental and the moral. Medical dietetics used to be about both what was good for you and what was good. In the modern order, medicine is just about what's good for you, avoiding disease and living long. Is and ought have largely gone their separate ways. Traditional dietetics, both in its local and global dimensions, was medical and moral. Present-day locavorism is almost wholly moral and political. Under one description, modern dietary localism is an intensely moralized form of nostalgia. It yearns in equal measure for purity, for authenticity, and above all, for a return to the face-to-face, the familiar and the artisanal. When you knew the miller's name, when you knew the particular pig that provided your bacon, when your own hens provided your own eggs, and even when you killed your own chicken. It's one of our many current vocabularies for embracing a vision, albeit a somewhat distorted vision, of the world we have lost and for despising the world in which we now live. But at the same time, our localism is also intensely scientized. Only the preferred scientific idiom is not medical, it's environmental. It's hard to imagine modern localism without reference to the science of energy costs and carbon emissions. And it's hard to imagine energy cost arguments cut free of a moral anchor. As an economist recently put it, we're not paying the environmental cost of all that travel. And not paying that cost is wrong, it's irresponsible, it's immoral. So we have a different vocabulary for connecting the instrumental and the moral. Bay Area Californians do not practice localism because that's who they are, which is the traditional dietetic vocabulary, but because that's the way they'd like everyone to be. They do not eat local foods to agree with their natures, but to preserve nature. Diet is still linked with a moral order and still linked with natural science, but the science pertains not to human nature, but to Mother Nature. Once the moral and the natural orders met in medicine, in our understandings of our bodies and of the power of what was on our plates to transform ourselves. Now we invoke environmental natural science as an independent, objective support of our moral order and to argue that what is on our plates has the power to transform the planet. Thank you.
I think that Professor Shapin will be glad to take some questions if there are questions some of you would like to ask.
You were saying that Alice Waters doesn't promote eating from various cultures, but on her pantry list in her cookbook, the spices that are on there obviously come from the Far East.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting. I suppose you're right. Yeah, the point was that I had said that Alice Waters does emphasize the local, and indeed having eaten both upstairs many times and downstairs once, I remember being told exactly where in Marin County a small piece of chervil on my plate had come from. It was very nice chervil. But the pantry contains what all of our pantries contain, and it's rather interesting. In quite a lot of the food TV cooking shows, you're given a larder, and the interesting thing is that it's taken for granted. What's in your larder? What's in my larder? Cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, saffron, the usual thing, and it's in Alice Waters too. And so it's a bit of a blind spot. I mean, both the cultural significance and the economic significance of that stuff in the larder and the political significance of that stuff in the larder is now invisible to some of our most eloquent and aggressive commenders of localism. I think your point is just right and interestingly right. So it's a little bit like biodiversity concerns focusing on animals that have faces and not being terribly interested in animals that don't have faces. So I appreciate the point, and it's an excellent one. We take away the larder, and the dietary localism is going to look and taste rather different.
Are there historical examples of food security being localism?
Yes, one of which I've mentioned, and that is the concerns over the cost. And you see this especially with sugar, tea, coffee, and chocolate. I think most notably in tea. The cost of the exchequer of the taste for exotic elements. I mean, one of the propelling forces of empire was all the tea in China had to be paid for in silver. But if we could grow it, if the Brits could grow it in Assam, and later in Kenya, but at the same time, some remarkable commentators, as remarkable as Herbert Spencer, the notorious social Darwinist, thought that that foreign entanglements driven by things like tea, sugar, and spice were a thoroughly bad thing for the political and economic integrity of the nation. So there's that. Now there is a minor strand in dietary localism that focuses on food security and vulnerability to terrorism. The recent debate, so nice, between Japan and China over the toxic gyoza would be an example of this. So as biosecurity becomes more and more a feature of the post-9/11 world, so there is an element of that in the commendation of dietary localism, as there is in the trust relationship that you form when you know the person who has grown your lamb or whose chickens have laid your eggs. So there's a biosecurity concern that has a global dimension, and there is a Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft concern at a local level.
Did you mean, when you said food security, that's a phrase that gets used to mean people who don't have enough food, or if they're food insecure? Is that what you meant?
No, I didn't mean.
All right.
You did mean that, yeah.
This question here.
I got that it was kind of a meta or Eurocentric viewpoint. I was wondering, does the rest of the world, do they share like a similar history, and kind of are they also pushing for dietary localism?
No, the question is, this was a Eurocentric account to which I responded, indeed it was. I simply don't know enough, and I'm not sure that our depth of knowledge for the Islamic Middle East, for India, for China is good enough. Mine certainly isn't good enough to give another account. And the cosmological and medical systems, of course, will vary
Ayurvedic medicine has got some interesting relationships with Galenic medicine, but they're not the same. So it is a Eurocentric account that I'm offering, and is fairly criticized for that basis. I simply don't know enough to deal with those concerns. But of course, the spice trade is a globalized trade, and it doesn't simply go from the Moluccan Islands or the Malabar coast through the Middle East onto Genoa, Venice, Rotterdam, and London. It goes from the Moluccan Islands to China, and on from China to the other parts of the Far East from very early periods.
You were talking about that there was a mindset, and what agrees with you is good for you, and what tastes good is good for you.
Yes.
So I'm just thinking as a parent, and all kids want sugar. So was that in history different, that the parent-to-kid relationship and what they're eating was different than what we're doing today?
Well, there is a bit. I mean, that quod sapit nutrit line is very, very widely distributed, and as I tried to indicate, it has got a cosmological justification. And people want to believe it too. There is a version of it in Britain, a little of what you fancy does you good, but that doesn't really apply to food. Anyway, and there is a critique of that at any period that you can name, and that it is commonly said, if it tastes good, it's good for you, but. However, the quod sapit nutrit sensibility is strong enough that you find from the early experiences with sugar, and sugar comes from the Middle East before it becomes the basis of a slave economy in the Caribbean and in the New World, of medical praise of sugar. Sugar is just wonderful. Sugar is a medicine. Sugar is the basic food stuff because it agrees with you. People like sugar. And there is no record that I can find of parents trying to get their kids to cut down on the sugar intake. There develops in the 18th century, certainly in the 19th century, a lament. And of course, during the Second World War and rationing, if you look at the rationing, the rigorous rationing regimen experienced by the British, the allocation of sugar and tea is enormous. And the thousands of lives that were lost transporting sugar to ration Britain during the war. So it's a very interesting question that you ask. The space, again, is occupied, so there is a critique of quod sapit nutrit, but it basically loses, and spectacularly in the case of sugar.
One or two more questions.
What do you perceive to be the greatest challenges to the food service industry in adopting dietary localism and using more local food sources?
I think one of the challenges, if I may say so, is the million people that live in my city and neighborhood, who, unlike you, blessed you, or unlike blessed Alice Walters, if we were to feed ourselves locally, would be eating St. Patrick's Day corned beef and cabbage for most of the year. And so the fact of the demography of our world and the distribution of population is such that it is far, and it might be interesting to, because Michael Pollan moves from Connecticut and suburban to New York to Berkeley, as he becomes more and more enthusiastic about dietary localism. It's hard for me to do dietary localism, much as I would like to do it. And it is hard to produce the kind of food that tickles the taste buds of foodies like myself without sinning, by helping not just myself to a larder that's globalized, but to fresh foods that are globalized. And so what I do, not for moral reasons, because I'm not smart enough to have the certainties of Michael Pollan, but what I do because I like the, look, this is what I like. I have to have a plug for Mary Joan. This is fabulous food. This is gathering together.
And our farmers markets will open in early June, and they'll have next to nothing available, and they'll have next to nothing available by the middle of October. And I'm just struck, I agree entirely about the tastiness of this food, and I would love to live here to have more of it. But let's start, Boston is not going to be fed by sourcing our foods within 100 miles radius. You can do it.
One more question here. Just asking, where your food comes from, getting the answer and sharing it with someone. There's this emphasis on storytelling. I'm wondering if there's something there, like as people, as human beings, maybe we need to tell stories like we used to, and I'm wondering if you see any patterns in that.
I think it is the story. So when Michael Pollan says that you should know the people who produce your chickens, eggs, and lettuce, it's lovely. I actually do know some of the people who produce the farmers, and it's a nice feeling. But I recognize in doing so that it's one of many expressions of uneasiness with the world in which we live. So the world in which we live is a world in which we yearn for that face-to-face encounter with the food that's on our plates and the people that provide the food that's on our plates. But we also roam the internet for, well, look, let's face it, how did I get to Gathering Together Farm? I got on a 737. And so we live with massive contradictions. And I'm not a moralizer, but so my preference for this food is because I'm a foodie and it tastes better, and I'll get it if I can get it. But I lack the moral certainties of some of the more enthusiastic proponents. I don't know enough to know it's better for the planet, and I know enough to know that it's easier for some parts of the planet and some people than for others. So I'm very divided about that. At the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think about that, but I do want to make an observation that the moral certainties about what people ought to do and what is good for the planet are more than I think I know and more than I think they ought to know.